to the state I am in, where every conversation points north. Here, we discuss topics that Alaskans and perhaps everyone should care about. I'm your host, Manny Coelho, a fellow Alaskan and your guide to the conversations that Alaskans want to hear from the individuals who are leading the way. Today's episode is just me, and I want to talk about a phrase I've been thinking about a lot lately and recently started using to close out the show. That phrase is keep north. At first, in my mind, it just seemed like the perfect tagline, given that this show in some way or another is about Alaska. Obviously, our state motto is North to the Future. Geographically, we're located in the Northern Hemisphere, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it carries multiple layers of meaning that I wanted to show up in some way with every guest and throughout every episode. To keep north is more than just being aware of a compass point. It's preserving what makes Alaska unique, lifting our eyes heavenward, and keeping watch over the direction we're going. So how do we preserve what makes Alaskan unique? Well, to capture this, I have to go back to a story that I recently read. And to do that, we'll have to step back in time a little bit. A lot, actually. 1961. So it's springtime at the very top of the world, Barrow, or Utqiagvik. The ice is starting to loosen, the sun is in the sky a little bit longer, and migratory birds are arriving in full force. Geese, eiders, ducks. For the people there, it's not about bird watching, though. It's about survival. So after a long, lean winter, relying on your previous year, hunting and gathering, these returning birds are what kept people alive during this shoulder season. So remember, it's 1960, and all across America, people at that time were standing up for their civil rights, with peaceful but bold demonstrations. College students sat at lunch counters for these sit-ins in Greensboro and Nashville to demand an end to segregation. So communities are marching, they're occupying spaces, and they're refusing to move until they feel like they're heard. This was just the spirit of that time. Ordinary people basically saying, enough is enough, and doing it in a way that forced the nation to pay attention. So here in Alaska, we had our own version of that same story, only it wasn't a sit-in on a lunch counter or in a bus line. It was on the tundra during that spring hunt in 1961. So the people of Barrow carried out what became known as the Duck Inn. So that winter had been pretty brutal. In fact, the whaling season was pretty disappointing. Only 2 whales were harvested that year, and that was hardly enough meat to feed the entire community. So the people of Barrow were counting down the days for that spring bird hunt when geese, ducks, and eiders returned north to nest. But here's the thing. In 1961, Alaska was basically a brand new state, and with statehood came the full weight of federal laws. And one of those laws was the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that was an old agreement between the U.S. and Canada and Mexico to protect bird populations. So on paper, it banned spring hunting of waterfowl, basically from March through September. And in the lower 48, that didn't really raise any eyebrows. No one really cared because those birds simply just weren't around during those months. But in Barrow, spring was the only season those birds were there, which meant that law directly clashed with the way families had survived for generations. So now you have this collide between the Alaskan way of life and the law. So now imagine the Barrow community is told that their long-awaited spring hunt, something that was done for countless generations, is illegal under this newly enforced federal rule now that they're a state. So into this tension stepped local leaders like Sadie Nyakuk, a Barrow resident, mother of many children, and one of the first women to serve as a magistrate in Alaska. She saw how absurd the law was, since it basically criminalized anyone in town who picked up a shotgun to go hunting that spring. She later said, "The treaty made criminals of all of our people. Every man, woman, and child who was able to hold a shotgun was guilty." And then came the spark. Tim Peacock was arrested in May of 1961 for hunting 3 geese. A few days later, John Nasinya was arrested for possessing an eider duck. The community knew they had a choice to make, either comply with the law that threatened their subsistence or respond. One elder in a 2011 mini documentary I just watched, it's by Uncivilized Films, which I'll link in the show notes, recalled the scene like this. I went to the game warden and told him to arrest me. I said, "Arrest me and take me to jail now. But if I get out of jail and find that my wife and children are hungry, I'm telling you now, if they are starving, I will use all my money down to the last penny, and I will look for you wherever you may be. And if I find you, I'm telling you now, I will kill you and feed you to my dogs." Like John Wick style situation going on in Barrow during that time. But I want you to pay attention because that line is violent and raw. But if you listen to it closely, it's not about ideology or politics. At that time, it was about survival. Like basically a parent saying, "I will not let my children starve because of a law." And I want to make sure that that desperation of that gentleman was shared in context and not let it justify some type of modern political violence. We definitely do not need that right now. So the next morning, 138 residents, men, women, and even children, marched in front of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office, each carrying a dead duck, and they demanded to be arrested. The federal game warden, Harry Pinkham, was stunned. He was overwhelmed by the amount of paperwork it would take to like arrest all these people. So in the end, no arrests actually took place. 600 pounds of ducks, though, were confiscated as evidence. And later, a letter was sent to President at the time, John F. Kennedy, and the secretary at the time, Stuart Udall. And all of a sudden, newspapers all over the U.S. picked up what was going on. And the governor of Alaska at that time, William Egan, and the federal government eventually reached kind of a weird compromise where basically Fish and Game would give the residents of that area on the North Slope a heads up of when they were going to be doing patrols so that they knew not to be hunting at that time, and basically just kind of turned a blind eye to what was going on. So that demonstration didn't actually change the law at the time, but it did kind of create a workaround that lasted for decades, that no one would get arrested and, subsistence hunting could still continue. So that was the heart behind the Duck Inn. And names like Sadie Neacock, Tim Peacock, and John Nasinya, I really hope I'm pronouncing those right. They deserve to be remembered. And if you've never read the full story about the Duck Inn, definitely go and look it up. There's a great mini documentary online that you can find when you Google search it. And, I start with this piece of Alaska history because to keep north means remembering that Alaska has a culture and a way of life that is worth protecting. It's a way that has existed long before most of us, and that's respect the land, take what you need, fish and hunt responsibly, and whatever we choose to develop in this land, we need to do it with sustainability in mind. If you live here because your ancestors, like the Inupiat, walked this tundra for generations, then you already know what it means to rely on and respect the land. If you came here later, like me, just drawn by the wild beauty and freedom instead of, the concrete jungles and crowds of the lower 48, you still share the same responsibility to protect and preserve that way of life. And if you're somewhere in between, ask yourself what keeps you here. What makes Alaska home for you? Because in the end, to keep north is about honoring Alaska's roots while recognizing that all of us, no matter when we arrived here, have a part to play in caring for this place we call home. To keep north doesn't just stop there, though. It also has a symbolic meaning for me, and that's that it points heavenward. And I know some of you might roll your eyes when I start talking about God. Maybe you've been hurt by religion, or maybe you're just skeptical. Like, I get it. But here's the truth. Even unbelief is a belief. So saying there is no God is still a claim about what you believe. So I really want to challenge you just to sit with me, consider, maybe what it means to keep north in your faith. Stick with me. So I wasn't raised in church. I was dragged into faith as a teenager, but eventually it grabbed a hold of me and I got deeply involved in church life. But I also wrestled with unanswered questions and tragedies of the world and the hurt that church itself can cause. There were definitely seasons where I walked away. But the more I looked at the world through science, history, and just the complexity of the physical world, the more I realized how much we don't know. And that realization didn't push me toward unbelief. It actually pushed me to really wonder about it. So think about it. We're on this rock hurtling through space, perfectly positioned in the solar system, just tilted at the right angle on the right axis, perfect distance from the sun. We have water, oxygen, gravity is just perfect all the time. And, outside of our little bubble, billions of stars and galaxies on top of galaxies. And, Earth is just so fragile and just in all of this chaos. And to think that that happened by chance is just hard for me to do. And honestly, I feel like it would take more faith to say that it happened by chance than to just say that I believe in a creator. Besides the physical world, though, there's us, humans. And, nature is like survival of the fittest. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there when you look at nature. But humans, we try to love one another. We find love. We seek justice. We, long for equity and compassion. And where did all that come from? Because evolution alone doesn't explain why we'd evolve to love our enemies or sacrifice ourselves for strangers. Like, that doesn't make sense when you look at nature. And that's where I circle back to God, because specifically Jesus, when you line up all the great prophets and teachers, Buddha, Muhammad, the, gods and idols of Hinduism, they all point toward God, toward enlightenment, but only Jesus claimed to be God. He didn't just give directions. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And that was a really bold, unpopular thing to do. Definitely in Jesus's time. I mean, they killed him for it. And definitely now in our current society. Tim Keller, who sadly passed away not too long ago, he was a Presbyterian pastor in Manhattan. And now think about that for a second, preaching the gospel in the middle of one of the most secular, skeptical, intellectual cities in the world. For him, there was no mega church vibe or TV preacher ick. He wasn't flashy or loud. He was just a thoughtful, philosophical dude and willing to talk about the hard things straight on. And, that's what really drew me to his teaching. I was thankful for a recommendation of a coworker that put me on to his books. But Keller helped me see that asking tough questions about faith isn't a threat to belief. It's part of the journey. He wrestled openly with doubt, science, suffering, culture, and yet still pointed people back to Jesus with clarity and humility. His writings and sermons you can find online, and, it was definitely the stuff that I was looking for and gave me permission to really dig deeper into my faith instead of walking away. And, one of the things that Keller used to say was that you can't just call Jesus a good moral teacher. His claims don't leave that option open. Jesus claimed to forgive sins, to be one with the Father, to be God himself. And that forces a decision. He was either a liar, a lunatic, or who he said he was. He was Lord of all lords. And, the more I wrestled with that choice, the more I came back to believe that Jesus being Lord makes the most sense of reality. And so that's the second meaning of keep north. Just like a compass keeps you from drifting, faith keeps your eyes heavenward. It's about remembering that we're not accidents and that there's more to this life than just surviving. To keep north is to remember where our ultimate direction lies, because here's the truth. Life will hand you things you can't prepare for, moments you can't unsee, choices you wish you could undo. Times when the weight of it all feels overwhelming and you don't know where to turn. I've had those moments, and I definitely know you have too, because we're all human. But it's just, there's a helplessness. And here's where faith becomes real, because belief in God isn't, as Karl Marx or Ryan from The Office would say, an opiate for the masses. It's not just wishful thinking or a crutch for people who can't handle reality. It's the exact opposite. It's what has given me peace in times of grief and direction when I was lost and provision when I needed it most. Faith doesn't take away hardship, but it reframes it. It reminds me that I'm not alone in it, that the struggle isn't the end of the story and that's all there is. So, to keep north is more than just a tagline. It's a way of, setting your eyes where hope comes from, especially when everything else around you feels like it's falling apart. All right. And finally, the third aspect of what it means to keep north is direction. So where are we headed as a state? The future doesn't arrive by accident. It's shaped by our choices, and especially by the leaders that we put in place to lead us. So to keep north means paying attention to that. It means choosing wisely who we elect. It means speaking our values clearly, and it means not letting someone else, steer the ship while we just check out. To keep north means we don't just get taken for a ride, basically. We stay active in local politics. We make an effort to stay informed. We speak up, if there's town halls or community events. And gosh, for heaven's sake, go out and vote. With such a small population, our voices carry a lot more power than you would think. It also means investing in our communities, checking on your neighbors and continuing to get together in the depths of winter. It's simple things like shopping local and supporting local businesses. I think it also means, keeping the lower 48 and the lower 48. And I know that probably sounds terrible, but I'm not talking about like closing ourselves off. I just mean like filtering the ideas through what actually fits here and what works here. We don't have to import every culture war and every policy model into our state. We should be able to debate and discuss what is going to serve Alaskans, us, our state, the best. And, there's a reason our population in the state doesn't grow much year to year. This isn't an easy place to live. Not everything is going to work. And I think that's the point. Alaska isn't for everyone. It's for the ones willing to work, to endure, to, thrive in hard conditions. And, those very challenges are what make us strong. So to keep north as a direction means carrying that spirit forward. So to be resilient, responsible, and respect one another, to make sure our kids don't just live here because we lived here, but that they carry forward those values, that make this place special. So when you hear me close the show with Keep North, I hope you don't just hear a tagline. Hear it as a reminder. Preserve what makes Alaska unique. Lift your eyes above the noise and look heavenward. And then pay attention to where we're headed and invest in the strength of our communities. Because the truth is, Alaska isn't easy. It never has been and probably never will be, but that's exactly what makes living here so worth it. The cold winters, the high cost of living, the distance that separates us, in our communities, all those things have a way of shaping us into people who are strong, resilient, and like deeply rooted in where we live. And I think that's something to recognize and to hold on to. Keep North is about making sure we don't lose that. It's about remembering that what we pass down to the next generation isn't just land and resources, but it's values. It's respect for the land, respect for each other, faith that anchors us when life feels overwhelming, and the grit it takes to thrive here when others would just give up. So wherever you're listening from, whether you've been here for generations or just found yourself drawn north like me, looking for something different, the call is the same. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to support the show by following and sharing it on social media, subscribing on YouTube, and leaving a review wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, wherever. It really helps more Alaskans and people everywhere join in on these conversations. As I prepare to apply and begin graduate school next year, you may notice fewer episodes each month. I know it's kind of a bummer, but I hope you'll bear with me through this transition. Because now, more than ever, I believe sharing the voices of our fellow Alaskans matters, and I will continue to do this work for as long as there are people willing to sit down and share meaningful conversations. Keep North, Alaska, and thank you for joining me on The State I'm In.